Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Card of the Week. We are nearing the end of Season 1, and I am here on my third favorite website, Arkham Build. We're going to roll a card, and honestly, for the love of all that is good and holy in the universe, I am just begging for a card that isn't Rogue or Survivor. We've gotten Rogue and Survivor, I think, like, every week. I actually don't even know, but let's see if we can maybe get something that's different. Oh, okay. This is very interesting to talk about here. My wish is achieved. We got a new card. So this is Forbidden Sutra. This is a 2-cost, 2-experienced neutral card. That's a specialist card, so that means it cannot be played by just everybody. It can only be played by blessed, cursed sorcerers only, if you have those traits as your investigator. It takes up a brain and, it takes up a hand slot. It gives you a brain and a wild when you commit. You get +1 skill value while resolving spells. As a reaction during a skill test on a spell event, take up to 3 horror. For each horror taken, reveal an additional chaos token for this test. Choose one of the revealed tokens to resolve and ignore the rest. We have an errata, where this card's reaction ability should be a lightning bolt ability and gains limit once per test, which does, actually work with how the rules work. So, I think with specialist cards, we kind of have to go after the elephant in the room, where we can kind of just like talk about the specialist mechanic just on its own here. I think as a whole, we can kind of agree that the specialist mechanic was like a cool sort of idea to explore, but I think ultimately wasn't really, I think like the power level was a little bit tapered. I do think that the current design team are pretty good at designing player cards. I think like their player cards are all pretty healthy for the most part. There's a few outliers, but there were a few outliers in the past as well. But it's one of those things where I think that the design sensibilities of kind of like making sure the cards were like fair and like reasonable and balanced, these were essentially like, I think was a kind of a detriment to the cards, because this ultimately kind of becomes like it was treated like a neutral card when this should kind of be like neutral plus, like specialist cards should have a little bit of spice to them that makes them feel like they're not exactly neutral cards, they're not exactly class cards, but they kind of exist somewhere in between. And I think that's ultimately my biggest wish for the specialist mechanic, that if they ever revisit it, I hope they kind of just embrace it and be like, why don't we just get kind of funky with it? These cards are so limited in scope, we might as well just like go ham with it, right? And I understand they're kind of hard to balance because, again, they're kind of like not neutral, not class. So it's one of those things where it's kind of tricky. So I think the next thing we could talk about here with Forbidden Sutra is, let's just look at who can play it. We can see this kind of list down here. You actually can't see them all just due to the way that I have my screen set up. But there's Agnes Baker, Parallel Agnes Baker, Akachi Onule, Amina Zidane, Calvin Wright, Dexter Drake 1, Dexter Drake 2, Jim Culver, Parallel Jim Culver, mind you, not the basic Jim Culver, Kohaku Narukami, Marie Lambeau, Patrice Hathaway, Rex Murphy, Sister Mary, and Parallel Wendy Adams. Now, the next thing we kind of have to look at with Forbidden Sutra that I think makes it a very interesting card of the week is who really wants this kind of effect? Because the +1 skill value while resolving spell events is actually honestly a pretty nice passive event, like passive like line of text to have on an asset that you play, especially in the hand slot for the Mystic class. This isn't a Mystic card, but if we go through the list, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 of the 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 investigators that can play it are Mystics. That's a big thing due to the fact that the Sorcerer trait is just kind of locked like so firmly in the Mystic class. It's just kind of how it works, right? But you can see that, like, especially in like the Mystic class, this works really well. Now, I think that there is some interesting use cases as well for, like, I'm looking at just this top lineup here, where you kind of just figure out, like, what are spell events that exist that people generally play. Read the Signs, Spectral Razor are the two obvious ones that come to mind. Those are kind of like the global elite, the top of the top, the cream of the crop when it comes to the ability of being a spell event that people want to actually play. Those cards are kind of unstoppable and almost kind of like too good, right? Like, they're just like, I mean, maybe Read the Signs is actually pretty fair, but like Spectral Razor is like a pretty powerful effect to just have on blast, right? And just like making that kind of just more reliable is something that like you don't really necessarily need to do, because Spectral Razor is combining stats, but especially if you're someone like, let's just say for example, Amina Zidane, who has all threes, or someone who might have low fist like Agnes Baker, right? Like 7 is pretty comfortable, but 8, potentially even 9 if this gives like +1 skill value to all skills, right? Like, I'm actually not too sure on the rules for that one off the top of my head here, but it's just a nice thing to have. Other nice events are like Blinding Light. There's the Mark of Elokos that just came out in Chapter 2. If you happen to be like I bought Drowned City and I bought the Chapter 2 box, you can kind of put those together to great effect. So overall, the top line is a good effect, and it's actually kind of close to Magnifying Glass in the idea that it's making a thing that you're doing over and over and over again better. Obviously, before anyone goes crazy and says you're nuts, in a much more limited scope, right? In a much more limited scope, and also we have the XP cost and the cost to actually play it, the resource cost to put into play. So it's not like obviously 1-to-1 to Magnifying Glass, but you can kind of see the sensibilities for how it's kind of like related to it. And of course, Magnifying Glass is for all investigating, Forbidden Sutra is just for events. I actually do like that it's like also playable in Kohaku, because I think Kohaku is designed in this cycle to be more of an event-based mystic. And I think that as a whole, this top line for Forbidden Sutra, I think is has the potential to grow in the future. I think that this is a line of text that is just really good, right? People might not think that just having a passive +1 to something that you do over and over and over and over again is good, but it actually is. It's just like a good way for you to like save on resources in the long run. You're basically like spending 2 to put this into play, and you're just passively generating. It's kind of why people enjoy playing Ritual Candles, right? Because it just is like passively making symbol tokens easier to manage. And I could see a universe where like people are playing Forbidden Sutra, upgrading it out of a Ritual Candles, and then holding a Ritual Candle 1. This also isn't a it's not a unique card or limit 1 per, so you could actually run 2 of these. And honestly, that's not like bad in the long term. Again, I think that spell events, like, even if we could look at like what is beyond Read the Signs and Spectral Razor, we also, I mean, the only other things I can really think of are Blinding Light, and that's kind of it that I can think off the top of my head. I might be missing a big one. There might be like a Seeker. Sorry, that's also parallel Rex Murphy, not regular Rex Murphy as well. Because like there might be like some random Seeker events, like maybe the one that you have to discard cards from your hand. I don't know if that's worth it for this kind of thing. But I think there's an interesting use case here for like Agnes Baker, right? Because she can play like parallel Agnes Baker. She can play spell cards 0 to 3, right? And I think that that could be very, very neat. Now, we kind of talked about the top line here, but what about this effect? Because I think in reality, this is where the designers intended for the majority of the use case for the card. I could be wrong with that assessment, but that's just kind of like my logic behind this, right? Because this is like, quote unquote, the flashy thing. This is the kicker, and this is the effect, right? So, as a lightning bolt, during a skill test on a spell event, take up to 3 horror. For each horror taken, reveal an additional chaos token for this test. Choose one of the revealed tokens to resolve and ignore the rest. Now, this line of text doesn't actually seem that usable. And I think that as a whole, this is obviously the big problem with Forbidden Sutra, right? It's a specialist card, and like other specialist cards, it kind of just, it doesn't really have a home. It feels like the power level's a little bit like kind of mid. Why are we wanting to take horror to reveal additional tokens? Like, that is a good effect, but it kind of already existed in the form of the statue in the Mystic class, which name has now slipped my mind. And then also this has kind of been like the Mask of Silenus that exists in the core set of the Mystic class here, right? Like, these effects exist and people aren't really playing them. And I think that like a more limited scope where it's only 4 spell events is kind of like an issue for Forbidden Sutra. Like, obviously, Agnes Baker, from the OG, from the original core, would like to be able to have another method of dealing horror on demand to be able to deal damage to enemies, and then you could potentially pay it off with the spell events here. Like, that's the theory. The other use case would be like Calvin Wright, right? Like, he can take horror to bump up his stats, but I think the reality is in Calvin Wright, it's kind of an incorrect choice to seek out damage in horror. You kind of just like, at least in the builds that I have found the most success with Calvin Wright, is you kind of just like play the game in a survivor fashion, and then over time you just get stronger and stronger. I think like, and also the other thing that's kind of missing is being able to have allies that like want horror dealt to them, right? Like, I think this is actually an interesting use case with like Jim Culver, the new ally from the new core set, like be able, this like can also say like draw a card. I can see that existing. I think as well with like Agnes Baker, it's really good with Peter Sylvester, right? Because you're basically, oh my god, it's gone. There we go. You basically can like get a horror each turn. You don't get to deal the damage to the enemies because it doesn't trigger her ability when it goes on Peter Sylvester, but it allows you to basically draw a token, an extra token for each of your spell events, basically hedging your bets and basically like turning off the auto-fail, right? And I think that's like ultimately the biggest problem for Forbidden Sutra, is that I can't really find a home for like any of the other investigators here. Like maybe Marie Lambeau would play it for the ability to kill things with Doom on them, like be able to kill Arcane Initiates on command, right? Maybe Sister Mary all the way down here could play it in some sort of like survivor heal, sorry, not like some sort of guardian heal machine to make it work, right? Like maybe Wendy Adams could play it for with the Peter Sylvester thing, but where is she going to have like the spell events that really paid off? She's kind of just cursed, right? Akachi is playing with assets. She's not as considered about the charges. It really comes down to like Agnes Baker is kind of really, and like maybe Parallel Agnes just for the stat boost, but like you're basically finding one of these effects that you want to play with an investigator. Original OG Agnes Baker is the only investigator that kind of wants to live with these two effects. And I think that's ultimately where Forbidden Sutra falters. It lives in that space, that issue with the specialist cards that I already talked about, where they brought down the power level and the scope was too limited. So it's kind of one of those things where like they're specialist cards, but most of the time when you're seeing specialist cards, they're like acting as more like investigator signatures, right? I kind of see this world where Forbidden Sutra exists, but it's kind of only for Agnes Baker. It's too limited in scope, and I think that if it was just a little bit broader, where for example, the +1 was just when you were resolving spells, but during a skill test on a spell event to take the 3 horror, or vice versa, or if they supported this card with more things that worried like that took horror. Like for example, that Cloak of Resonance that came out in the new core set, that's an interesting thing with Forbidden Sutra. And this is why I also think I'm going to place a bet that I do think that Forbidden Sutra in the long term is going to grow in value in comparison to some other specialist cards. These are potentially like long form gambles, and we're going to see if they pay off. Thank you for watching, everybody. I hope you enjoyed this card of the week. We'll be back next week for another episode, but in the meantime, thanks for watching, have a good one, and as always, a GG's.